But as you can see by the illustrations which he drew and copyrighted in 1998, because he also forensically illustrated the remnants of the Japanese military gondola. When he drew these, he damns his own idea of these being aliens by essentially drawing a shaven-headed Asian male, something which I think is pretty unmistakable by forensic standards when you take a look at the face that he put together, and yet this is accepted automatically as something that is alien in all of our eyes. Keep in mind that in science fiction films during the 50s and the 60s, they used to actually have Asians play aliens, simply because they couldn't afford makeup for something more sophisticated. So that's something that it may sound like it's silly to concentrate on, but I'm dealing with an extremely insidious form of racism which is lingering. And the progress that has been made for other ethnic groups has not been made specifically in the Asian Pacific Islander population in America, because they're simply too quiet, they're simply too few. They are the lowest minority group within the United States, and there are examples of these Asian groups which America is so totally unaware of that it really boggles the mind in terms of the level of ignorance. An example would be the Choctaw of Southeast Asia, which basically are a phenomena of an insurgency of an Asian race into the United States, of which Americans are totally unaware because they are so unfamiliar with so much in terms of Asian anthropology. And the Choctaw are essentially a minority group of Southeast Asia specifically, who are basically Asian pygmies. And this will be anthropologically confirmed. There are, of course, pygmies in Southeast Asia, just as there are in Africa. And the point of fact is that they form a minority group which has had a kind of a fairly heavy impact within the rural lifestyle of Laos and Cambodia. During the Second World War, they were the only minority group who the Japanese specifically targeted for extermination. And one of the reasons why was because they were despised by all of their tribal neighbors as being shamans of black magic. It was assumed by the local tribal groups that just as in South America, where you have people essentially going out of the body using the shamanic experience of purgative drugs, such as psilocybin and the various other mushrooms, it was assumed that these tribes, the Choctaw, were using their opiates to derive the same effect. And it was believed that when they were astral projecting out of their bodies, that they were able to take other people's souls, kill people in their sleep. We may dismiss all of this as superstition, but it affects people quite profoundly. Certainly when the Laotian minorities were brought to the United States in the 1970s, over 100,000 of them were airlifted to the U.S. And in 1977, literally dozens of them began to die of SUNS, which is sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. And they were dying at such a rate that it was just astonishing. Literally, it was 60% of all Hmong in America, meaning every single male, since it was mostly males that were experiencing sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome, and some females underwent at least one near-death SUNS experience. That's 3 times the norm for the U.S. population. And what they were missing in their communities, because they had been relocated to the urban areas of the United States, was the central pillar of their architectural makeup of their villages, which was universal amongst Hmong villages and dwelling places back in their native homeland, to house their ancestral spirits. Because any of these central pillars are absent in American architecture, especially in apartments and in houses, they felt that their ancestors could not protect them from the attacks of the Choctaw. Now, even Special Forces servicemen, even men like Daniel Brinkley, who served in Special Forces in Southeast Asia, people who are intimately familiar with the Laotian and Cambodian tribal peoples, tend to assume that the Choctaw is the name for what is interpreted as the death spirit. They interpret this as a spiritual phenomena. They don't understand that many of the locals were referring to a specific ethnic group. And because these people were a specific ethnic group that was essentially felt by the Hmong community to be attacking them in their sleep, it finally took the efforts of a courageous anthropologist, a medical anthropologist, as a matter of fact, by the name of Dr. Shelley Adler, to relocate them into the rural areas of the United States where they could once again build ancestral pillars around a central village architecture, that these deaths stopped. But in the meantime, literally dozens, if not hundreds, of Cambodian and Laotian men died of what we would term a severe case of old hag syndrome. But in terms of how did they get here, because they were convinced that the Hmong were here, the Choctaw were here. The Hmong were convinced that the Choctaw had infiltrated the United States. I know for a fact that they did because I saw them when I grew up in the Tenderloin, which is now known as the Little Saigon of San Francisco. And when I saw them myself conducting a ritual, and my father was able to identify them because of his service as a gunboat sailor in China, when there were still Choctaw minorities in China before they were exterminated by the Japanese, my father, I thought that these were all children holding a ceremony in an adjacent apartment complex. My father identified them immediately as Choctaw. And I asked him what they were doing, and he said they're holding a fertility ritual. And of course, one of the things that make the Choctaw such a threatening tribal presence to so many other tribes in their area is their fertility rituals involve sacrifice, usually human. And they feel that they can conduct this sacrifice without weapons, without blades, without blow darts, simply by projecting themselves out of their body. Now, it's a fact, in many of the government documents I was dealing with that concerned the Vietnam War, it's a fact that many of them got here misidentified as orphans. As a matter of fact, there was a plane, a U.S. Air Force cargo jet carrying 243 Vietnamese orphans to the United States that crashed and burned in what I believe to be about 1975, that killed over 100 children right after takeoff. And when that plane crashed, they tried to load up another plane with orphans and apparently loaded up many of these Choctaw tribesmen instead, who were identified as orphan children. And they were brought to the United States, and that was probably the first level of the insurgency. It's assumed at this point amongst the community of Southeast Asians that along with the 100,000 Laotians who were brought over in the aftermath of the war, there are 40,000 Choctaw. And again, these are Asian pygmies who are misidentified consistently as children, which is one way that they escape legal persecution when they do resort to murder by ritual that involves blow dart or blades or other tribal weapons that they can basically resort to for specific rituals. So when the U.S. community is this ignorant of the nuances of Asian culture, the sizes of Asians, the ability to identify these different ethnic groups, how can you confront what I'm saying with this blatant denial just on the basis of this belief that you know everything? And especially in this day and age, you may think that there is this media exposure of the rest of the world to you, but that's not true, because over half of the world's population, well over 3 billion people, have never, ever, in their entire lives, conducted or received a single telephone call. And the number of people using a computer is less than 10% of the world's population. Even if that grows by a doubling, by a tripling, it is nothing compared to the rest of the world's population, which not only does not know of this so-called information revolution, it is one in which the information revolution agents, such as those posting on this website, do not appreciate because they have no idea of the rest of the world. You exchange little bits of gossip amongst yourselves, and nothing new is really learned. In terms of the J. Krog 08, when he speaks of the equating this to Holocaust denial, this is one of those that are extremely dangerous in terms of this kind of assertion. When he says it's it's pro-Japanese propaganda, when it's this kind of statement about nukes not being used again because they're too dangerous. He at the same time contradicts himself by citing 1951 Taiwanese documents from the place where I was born about Japanese troops